Hello and thanks for joining me. Chapter 25, Book 1 of the Discourses of Epictetus, you see that, is titled On the Same Theme. So what this is referring to, on the same theme, I think is it's a continuation of the discourse that was in the previous chapter, which was discussing, what's the best way to face difficulties in life, or how to face difficulties. And in that discussion, in the previous chapter, there was this mentioning of a regular Stoic topic, which is recognizing what's in our control and what is not in our control, and really only focusing on those things that are in our control. And I think that this discourse really takes that thread up and focuses on that topic almost exclusively. So I would say the topic of this discourse is really, how to recognize what's in our control and what's not in our control. And so, he gives one of the students then says, well, let me know, command me. In other words, tell me what the answers are. And Epictetus goes, well, Zeus has already given you your intellect and given you your talents, the level of intellect that you have and the level of talents that you have. I would say even, just interpreting it myself, that, we also get placed in a station in life. Generally speaking, we get established in a place in life, like a certain culture, and so there are all these sorts of things that we have that are part of our skill set and that are part of us. And this is what, we can say that Zeus gave us, or, nature gave us, or fate gave us, or whatever. And so Epictetus is saying, if Zeus gave you these tools for you to use, can I give you anything better than what nature gave you? And so he's really telling, I think, the student, to use his own intellect and use his own tools that nature has given him in order to, figure out what is in his life that's in his control, and what is in his life that is, or what that occurs to him that's outside of his control. So there's a kind of a cool quote from Epictetus that I thought was kind of cool, that I'll just kind of read right quick. It says, "We are interested only in those things which are under our authority, and we pay no regard to things over which others have authority. What else is there to worry about?" So Epictetus, I think, here is saying, once we pay attention to only those things, if we pay attention to only those things over which we have authority, over which we have control, and we disregard everything that occurs in life over which we have no control, which is other people and a lot of things that occur that over which we have no control, then we really have nothing else to worry about. And this theme is sort of repeated, I think, throughout this discourse. He does end up talking about in the next section this thing called evil case, or case. And so I did a little research on it, and it looks like that Stoicism had this idea of cases, and it comes from grammar, although it's not really a grammatical interpretation. I think it's a metaphysical interpretation, but I couldn't find a lot about cases. At offhand, I did find a journal article, which I will mention a little bit later, after this, at the end of this chat. But so for the cases part, I didn't completely understand what it was he was talking about, but he gave a couple of examples there that I thought were very helpful in sort of highlighting again, those things over which we have control and things we don't have control over. So just some quick examples. One he gives is this: one person says, I don't want to go to such and so's house because he tells the same war stories over and over. And I thought that was kind of funny that, this idea of a person being kind of boring because they tell the same story over and over is apparently a very old, something that's been occurring for a very long time in human society, because it's still going on today. But but another person says, well, I like hearing his story. So that's one of those things that's in your control. If you're putting yourself in that person's dinner, then and then the story that he's probably going to tell is one of those things that's outside of your control. So if you're there, that's outside of your control. So it's a waste of your energy to become annoyed by it. Likewise, the person who wants to go, it's in his control to go. He actually finds the situation enjoyable. So that's kind of a difference there. Another example he gives is a room, a smoky room. Like there's a room that doesn't have a lot of smoke in it. Maybe you would tolerate that, because I think what he's getting at here is, when does a person exercise, where's that line sometimes between control and not control? He's talking about a room with smoke in it, so you might not be able to control the fact that the room has smoke in it. You might stay in that smoky environment if it's not too bad, but then if it gets worse, then you might withdraw if you're free to do so, if someone's not forcing you to stay there. In which case it would be outside of your control anyway to be in the smoky room. And another example he gives is exile, and living in another city, because back in this era of Stoicism, back in the Roman era, exile was a very common thing that was practiced by the government, especially to the sort of the noble class, the wealthy class whose writings we mostly have. They might get exiled, and philosophers were often being exiled for running afoul of an emperor here and there. And so they use this a lot. You're being forced to live in another city. Someone in authority like an emperor or someone tells you, you can't live there, you need to live there. And I'm thinking of this in applying it to modern day life, is like, maybe your job requires, maybe you would like to live in Paris, but the circumstances of your life are such that you can't live in Paris for one reason or another. It's outside of your control. And so, but at what level then would you move? So it may become possible for you to live in Paris, and then if you don't do so, I think that might be what he's talking about as far as evil case, but I'm not exactly sure. But where you live sometimes is outside of your control, and then sometimes it becomes later in your control, and that's when you could act if you felt like it was in your best interest to do so. So I hope that sort of made sense. There's another example that then the last section that a student talks about, or one of the students talks about, I want to go to the theater, but I want to sit where the senators do, and I get crushed. And Epictetus says, well, then don't go to the theater, because if you're going to go, and the student says, well, I can see better from this place, and Epictetus says, well, you're making that judgment yourself. What crushes you is your own self. Only you can really do that, because you're making that decision to go and put yourself in that situation. You can either not go to the theater, you can go sit somewhere that's not as good of a seat, but yet you aren't crushed, or you can make the choice to be crushed, in which case, you have no reason to be annoyed. That's how I interpreted that little section, so I'm not sure if that is really what Epictetus meant entirely, but that's sort of what I'm taking away from that. So, and then finally, he gives a couple of more examples, like slander. Like if a person, what is slander? That's when a person speaks bad about you. What harm can they do you? A person speaking harm against you cannot do anything really to you, unless you have that weakness where it gets to you somehow, because really it's sort of like a slander against something like a stone. Epictetus says, is meaningless to the stone, and likewise to yourself. You can't necessarily control the slanderer or what's being said about you by other people, but you can control sort of how it's affecting you. And then finally, the final example he uses is someone comes along and tears the toga off of a person and rips it. It's ruining the clothes, but not ruining the man inside. So that's sort of, I think, the same thing as slander. It might be on the surface something that appears harmful, but internally it's not. So that's sort of what I took away from that. So back to the evil cases. So I did some research. I found an article called "The Stoic Notion of a Grammatical Case" by Michael Fried, and it's from 1994, the Bulletin of the Institute of Classical Studies. And I did manage, with an academic contact of mine, to get a copy of this article. And so it's going to be some side reading for me to kind of try to understand a little bit more about Stoic cases, because I don't know a lot about that. So he did mention here, Epictetus mentioned again the primary conceptions too, which I did a video on one of the previous chapters. I'll link to that below. This is Epictetus was telling the students, fall back on your learning, on primary concepts that you've learned, on what you've learned from philosophers. Really use the tools that you have at your disposal in order to help you to determine what's in your control and what's out of your control. That was sort of how I interpreted that discourse. So I'm going to leave it there. I feel like I kind of rambled on this discourse, but there was a lot in it, but it was really mainly around this central idea, again, of what you have authority over, meaning what's in your control, and then what you don't have control over, and figuring that out. Once you have, then it helps you to face difficulties ultimately in your life, because you're really only using your energy for those things over which you can have some impact over, and you're not spinning your wheels, using up your energy and your spirit, your spiritual energy, your psychic energy, in ways that you're never going to be able to change anyway. So, hope that made sense. The next chapter is chapter 26. It's called, What is the Law of Life? So I haven't had a chance to read through that, but I will soon, and have a chat coming up on it in the near future. So until then, take care.